In a quiet Seattle suburb, 72-year-old Sarah Jackson faced losing everything during a family dinner. Her son's new wife, Brittany, wasn't building relationships. She was conducting reconnaissance, demanding Sarah move to Sunset Manor nursing home. Brittany had no idea she was threatening a retired investment banker who'd secretly amassed millions over 3 decades. Sarah's response, purchasing the entire nursing home, would expose family betrayals and challenge assumptions about power and aging. What began as manipulation would become Sarah's ultimate victory, proving the most dangerous opponent is the one everyone underestimates. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Jackson had been preparing Sunday dinners in this kitchen for 43 years. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she adjusted the heat under the roast, the same motion she'd performed countless times when David was small and would sit at the breakfast bar, swinging his legs and telling her about his week. The house held those memories in its walls, the laughter echoing from the living room, the arguments over homework at the dining table, the quiet conversations late at night when teenage worries kept sleep at bay. Today felt different. The familiar rhythm felt forced, performative. "Mom, we're here," David's voice carried from the front door, followed by the sharp click of heels on hardwood. Sarah smoothed her apron and checked her reflection in the kitchen window. At 72, she maintained the same composed demeanor that had served her well through decades of board meetings and investment negotiations, though David had never known about those particular skills. "In the kitchen, honey," she called back, noting how her son's footsteps hesitated in the hallway. She could picture him steeling himself, preparing for whatever performance his new wife expected. Brittany Walsh Jackson entered first, her real estate agent's smile perfectly calibrated. "Sarah, what a lovely home you have here." Her eyes swept the kitchen with professional assessment, cataloging square footage and potential renovations. So much character in these older places. The word, older, hung in the air like smoke. "Thank you, dear." Sarah accepted Brittany's air kiss, catching the expensive perfume that couldn't quite mask the calculating coldness beneath. "David, you look thin. Are you eating enough?" Her son's face softened with genuine affection. "I'm fine, Mom. Just busy with the new project at work." He moved to hug her properly, and for a moment, Sarah felt the boy he'd been, the one who'd run to her after nightmares, who'd saved his allowance to buy her flowers on Mother's Day. "What David means," Brittany interjected smoothly, "is that we've both been incredibly busy. The Seattle market is absolutely booming right now. I closed 3 deals this week alone." She positioned herself between mother and son with practiced ease. "Actually, Sarah, I've been meaning to talk to you about that. Your neighborhood has seen some remarkable appreciation. Properties like this one." "Are you hungry?" Sarah interrupted, her tone pleasant but firm. "Dinner should be ready soon." Brittany's smile never wavered, but her eyes sharpened. "Of course. Though I have to say, this kitchen is charming. Very authentic. David's told me so much about growing up here." "Has he?" Sarah glanced at her son, who was studying the family photos on the refrigerator with sudden intensity. "What stories has he been sharing?" "Oh, Brittany waved her hand dismissively. "Childhood memories. Though I imagine it must be quite a lot of work, maintaining a place this size. All these rooms, the upkeep, the utilities." She pulled out her phone and snapped a quick photo of the breakfast nook. "Sorry, occupational hazard. I'm always looking at spaces with fresh eyes, just thinking about flow and functionality." Sarah's trained eye caught the deliberate angle of the shot, highlighting the worn linoleum, the dated cabinets, the small crack in the window that she'd been meaning to fix. "Are you planning to redecorate your own place?" "Actually, we're looking at new construction. Something more suitable for our lifestyle." Brittany's gaze swept meaningfully around the kitchen again. "Modern conveniences, better security systems, communities designed for specific life stages." The implications settled between them like a chess piece being moved into position. David cleared his throat. "Mom, is there anything I can help with?" "You could open the wine," Sarah suggested, grateful for the momentary respite. As David busied himself with the corkscrew, she watched Brittany drift toward the living room, phone still in hand. "This mantle is original, isn't it?" Brittany called back. Another photo. The craftsmanship in these old homes is just irreplaceable. Of course, heating bills must be astronomical with these high ceilings and single-pane windows. Sarah followed her into the living room, where Brittany was examining the built-in bookshelves with the same clinical attention she'd paid the kitchen. The shelves held decades of accumulated life: David's childhood books, Sarah's collection of financial journals, family photos spanning generations. "You must have wonderful memories here," Brittany said, her tone dripping with sympathy. "It must be difficult, though, being rattling around in all this space by yourself. Don't you ever feel isolated?" "I find I enjoy my own company," Sarah replied evenly. "Oh, I'm sure you do. But there's something to be said for community, don't you think? People your age often find such comfort in shared activities, professional care when needed." Brittany lifted a silver-framed photo of Sarah and David from his high school graduation. "You know, I've been researching some wonderful senior living communities in the area. The amenities are incredible: fitness centers, social activities, medical care right on site." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening. "How thoughtful of you to research that." "Well, I just want what's best for family." Brittany's smile was radiant. "David worries about you, you know. We both do. Living alone at your age, in a house this size, accidents happen. And if something were to go wrong, who would know?" "Mom!" David's voice carried from the kitchen. "The timer's going off." Sarah excused herself, but not before catching Brittany photographing the ornate crown molding and noting something in her phone. In the kitchen, David was pulling the roast from the oven, his movements careful and familiar. "Smells perfect," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Your father always said that," Sarah murmured, testing the vegetables with a fork. "He'd stand right where you're standing and announce that dinner smelled perfect, even when I'd burned the potatoes." David's expression softened with memory, but before he could respond, Brittany appeared in the doorway. "David, you have to see this view from the front window. The sightlines to the street are remarkable, perfect for security assessment." She turned to Sarah with that same brilliant smile. "You really should consider upgrading your security system, Sarah. A woman living alone in a house this visible from the street. Well, it's just smart to take precautions." As they moved to the dining room, Sarah caught Brittany taking one more photo, this time of the antique china cabinet that had belonged to Sarah's mother. The same cabinet where she kept her important papers, including financial documents that would surprise a great many people. Dinner proceeded with Brittany dominating the conversation, regaling them with tales of her professional success while subtly redirecting any attempt by Sarah to share family stories or ask David about his work. Each anecdote seemed carefully chosen to demonstrate Brittany's competence, her connections, her understanding of financial matters. "The interesting thing about property valuation," Brittany was saying as she cut her roast with surgical precision, "is that people often have no idea what they're sitting on, especially in a market like this. Properties that families think of as sentimental can represent real financial security when properly leveraged." Sarah sipped her wine, observing. In her years as an investment banker, she'd learned to read people the way others read stock reports. Brittany wasn't making conversation. She was building a case. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself standing at the kitchen sink, watching through the window as David and Brittany walked to their car. They paused by the driver's door, Brittany's animated gestures suggesting intense discussion. Even from a distance, Sarah could see David's shoulders slump in what she recognized as his childhood posture of resignation. The taillights disappeared around the corner, leaving Sarah alone with the dinner dishes and a growing certainty that this evening had been reconnaissance, not reconciliation. Brittany hadn't come to build family relationships. She'd come to assess assets and identify weaknesses. Sarah dried her hands slowly, her mind already shifting into the analytical mode that had served her well in hostile takeover negotiations. The game had begun, though Brittany didn't yet realize her opponent had been playing at a much higher level for far longer than anyone suspected. The phone call came 3 days later, just as Sarah was reviewing her quarterly investment statements in the small study off her bedroom. The morning light filtered through lace curtains her mother had hung decades ago, casting familiar patterns across the mahogany desk where she conducted business most of the world didn't know existed. "Mom?" David's voice carried an edge she hadn't heard since his teenage years. "I wanted to check on you. How are you feeling today?" Sarah set down her reading glasses, noting the careful phrasing. "I'm feeling fine, honey. Is there a reason I shouldn't be?" A pause. In the background, she could hear Brittany's voice, too low to make out words but urgent in tone. "Well, Mrs. Henderson mentioned she hadn't seen you in the garden lately, and you seemed a little tired at dinner on Sunday." Mrs. Henderson, Sarah pictured her neighbor, a well-meaning woman who'd moved in 2 years ago and had appointed herself the neighborhood's informal social coordinator. "I've been busy with some personal projects, and I wasn't tired. I was observing." Observing what? The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to address directly. Sarah had learned long ago that the most dangerous conversations were the ones where everyone pretended to be talking about something else. "Nothing important, dear. Just family dynamics." Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, Brittany and I have been talking. We're worried about you living alone in that big house. Maybe it would be good if we checked in more regularly. You know, to make sure everything's okay." There it was, the opening move in what Sarah recognized as a carefully orchestrated campaign. She'd seen similar strategies in corporate boardrooms, where concern for stakeholder welfare masked acquisition attempts. "That's very thoughtful but unnecessary. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." "Of course you are," David said quickly. "It's just, well, things happen. Remember when you locked yourself out last month?" Sarah frowned. She had indeed locked herself out, but only because she'd been distracted while bringing in groceries, something that could happen to anyone at any age. She'd solved the problem herself by retrieving the spare key from her garden shed. "I handled that situation just fine." "I know, but what if it had been something more serious? What if you'd fallen? Or had a medical emergency?" The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with David cycling through a litany of concerns that felt rehearsed. Each scenario painted Sarah as increasingly fragile, increasingly dependent, increasingly in need of oversight. After hanging up, Sarah sat in the quiet study, her mind working through the implications. The call hadn't been about checking on her welfare. It had been about establishing a record of concern, creating a narrative of decline that didn't match her reality. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Sorry if I seemed pushy. Just love you and want you to be safe. B says there are some great communities we could tour together, just to see options." B says. The puppet strings were showing. The campaign escalated over the following weeks. David called every other day, his questions becoming more pointed, more clinical. Had she been eating properly? Taking her medications on schedule? Remembering to pay bills? Each inquiry felt like an item on a checklist, a box being systematically ticked. Sarah began to notice other changes. Her mail delivery seemed inconsistent, bills arriving later than usual, bank statements going missing entirely. She found herself double-checking locks she was certain she'd secured, questioning her own memory in a way that felt foreign and uncomfortable. The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning when she caught Mrs. Henderson at her mailbox, sorting through what appeared to be several pieces of Sarah's mail. "Oh," Mrs. Henderson startled, nearly dropping the envelopes. "Sarah, These were delivered to my box by mistake. The postal service, you know how they are these days." Sarah accepted the mail with a polite smile, noting that the envelopes showed no signs of misdirection. Her address was clearly printed on each one. More interesting was the way Mrs. Henderson's eyes avoided hers, the slight flush creeping up the woman's neck. "Has anyone asked you to keep an eye on me, Eleanor?" The direct question caught Mrs. Henderson off guard. "Well, your son's wife did mention that you might be having some difficulties. She asked if I could just watch out for any concerning behaviors. As a neighbor, you understand?" Sarah understood perfectly. Brittany was building a case, gathering evidence of incompetence from multiple sources. It was a sophisticated approach, create doubt about Sarah's mental acuity while positioning herself as the concerned family member seeking professional guidance. That evening, Sarah made a call she hadn't made in over a year. "Harold?" It's Sarah Jackson. I need to see you. Harold Kim's voice warmed immediately. Sarah, what a pleasant surprise. Though you sound like business rather than pleasure. Very much business. Can you come by tomorrow? There are some matters I need to discuss. Of course. Should I bring the usual files? Sarah paused, considering. Harold had been her financial advisor for 23 years, one of the few people who knew the true extent of her wealth. He'd helped her navigate investments with the same careful discretion she'd once applied to client portfolios. Bring everything. And Harold? This conversation needs to stay between us for now. Understood. Harold arrived the next afternoon carrying his familiar leather portfolio, his silver hair impeccably styled despite retirement. At 70, he remained sharp as the day Sarah had first worked with him, back when few people took a widowed bank teller's investment aspirations seriously. You look concerned, he said, settling into the living room chair where David used to read as a child. Sarah poured tea from her mother's china service, the ritual giving her time to organize her thoughts. I believe my family is planning an intervention. The goal appears to be moving me into assisted living. Harold's eyebrows rose slightly. Based on what grounds? Manufactured concerns about my competence. My daughter-in-law has been quite systematic in her approach. She outlined Brittany's campaign, watching Harold's expression shift from surprise to professional assessment. His years in financial planning had given him experience with family dynamics around wealth and inheritance. What's her background, he asked. Real estate. Foster care upbringing. She sees this house as a significant asset. Harold nodded slowly. And David? Believes he's protecting me. He's always been susceptible to confident people telling him what he should think. Have they made any direct moves yet? Not yet. But I can feel the pressure building. I need to understand my options before they force my hand. Harold opened his portfolio, revealing the comprehensive financial picture that would surprise anyone who knew Sarah only as David's elderly mother. Well, you certainly have options. The question is how far you're willing to go to exercise them. Sarah studied the numbers. Decades of careful investments, compound interest, and strategic financial decisions that had transformed modest earnings into substantial wealth. She'd built this security quietly, methodically, never drawing attention to her growing financial independence. What do you know about Sunset Manor? She asked. Harold looked puzzled. The nursing home on Pine Street? Not much. Why? Research it for me. Ownership structure, financial status, any operational challenges. I want a complete picture. Sarah, you're not seriously considering... I'm considering all possibilities. If my family wants to treat me like a helpless dependent, perhaps it's time they learned exactly who they're dealing with. Harold studied her face, recognizing the same steely determination that had made her one of his most successful clients. I'll have a report by Monday. After Harold left, Sarah sat in her study as evening shadows lengthened across the desk. The house felt different now. Not like the sanctuary she'd built over 4 decades, but like a piece on a chessboard, its value measured in square footage and market comparisons rather than memories and meaning. Her phone buzzed. Another text from David. Hey Mom, just checking in. Brittany found some information about a really nice place called Sunset Manor. They have a waiting list, but B thinks she might be able to get you priority consideration. Would you be open to at least taking a tour? Sarah stared at the message for a long moment before typing her response. I'd be happy to tour any facility you think I should see. She wasn't lying. She would indeed be interested in touring Sunset Manor, though perhaps not for the reasons David and Brittany expected. If they wanted to treat this as a strategic game, she would play to win. The reply came quickly. Great. B is setting something up for next week. Love you. Sarah set the phone aside and returned to her investment statements. Tomorrow she would begin her own research into Sunset Manor. By the time Harold delivered his report, she intended to know everything there was to know about the facility David and Brittany saw as her future home. She had spent 40 years learning that the best defense was often an unexpected offense. If her family couldn't see her as she truly was, perhaps it was time for a revelation that would change everything. The game had begun in earnest, and Sarah Jackson had never lost when the stakes truly mattered. Harold's report arrived on Monday morning, delivered in person with the gravity that 23 years of professional collaboration had taught them both to appreciate. Sarah opened the folder at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd once helped David with algebra homework, now serving as the command center for what might be the most important negotiation of her life. Sunset Manor is vulnerable, Harold said without preamble, settling into the chair across from her. The corporation that owns it has been struggling since the pandemic. Occupancy is down, maintenance costs are up, and they're carrying significant debt. The facility itself has potential, but current management is focused on cutting costs rather than improving care. Sarah studied the financial documents, her trained eye picking up the telltale signs of an organization in decline. Revenue projections that seemed optimistic, deferred maintenance items that suggested systemic problems, staffing ratios that explained why families might be dissatisfied with care quality. Purchase price? She asked. Based on current market conditions and their debt load, I estimate they'd consider offers starting around $8 million. You could structure it various ways. Cash offer would give you the strongest negotiating position. Sarah nodded, mentally reviewing her portfolio. The number was well within her means, though it would represent a significant portion of her liquid assets. More importantly, it would be a move that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of her situation with David and Brittany. There's something else, Harold continued, his tone shifting slightly. I made some discreet inquiries about your daughter-in-law. Brittany Walsh Jackson has an interesting professional history. Oh? 3 complaints filed with the real estate board over the past 5 years, all related to conflicts of interest involving elderly clients. Nothing that resulted in sanctions, but a pattern of aggressive tactics when dealing with seniors looking to downsize or transition to care facilities. Sarah felt a chill that went deeper than the October morning. She's done this before. It appears so. The complaints suggest she has a particular talent for identifying vulnerable elderly homeowners and positioning herself to benefit from their transitions. The implications settled between them like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. This wasn't personal. It was Brittany's business model. Sarah just happened to be the current target. How long do you think we have? Sarah asked. Based on the tour they're arranging, I'd say they're moving toward a formal intervention within the next 2 weeks. If I were building their case, that's the timeline I'd use. Sarah closed the folder, her decision crystallizing. Draft a preliminary offer for Sunset Manor. Nothing formal yet, but I want to understand their interest level and timeline. Sarah, are you certain about this approach? There might be less dramatic ways to, Harold. Her voice carried the authority that had once silenced boardrooms full of aggressive executives. They want to treat me like a helpless dependent. I intend to show them exactly what kind of dependent they're dealing with. The call came that evening, just as Sarah was finishing dinner. David's voice carried a forced cheerfulness that reminded her painfully of the child who used to lie about broken toys, hoping she wouldn't notice. Mom, great news! Brittany managed to arrange a tour of Sunset Manor for tomorrow afternoon. The director is personally showing us around. How efficient of her. Yeah, she has connections in the industry. Anyway, we'll pick you up around 2. You'll love this place, Mom. It's really beautiful, and the care standards are supposed to be excellent. Sarah wondered who had provided that assessment, given Harold's research into the facility's actual conditions. I'm looking forward to it. And Mom, maybe we could grab dinner afterward. There are some things Brittany and I have been discussing that we'd like to talk through with you. There it was, the moment she'd been anticipating. The tour would be followed by the intervention. The carefully rehearsed presentation designed to make her relocation seem inevitable and reasonable. Of course, dear. I always enjoy spending time with you both. The next afternoon arrived gray and cold, Seattle's autumn asserting itself with the kind of persistent drizzle that made indoor spaces seem particularly appealing. Sarah dressed carefully, not in the defeated manner of someone being processed into institutional care, but with the quiet elegance she'd cultivated during her banking career. If this was to be a performance, she intended to control her part in it. David and Brittany arrived precisely on time, Brittany's professional smile bright enough to cut through the gloom. "Sarah, you look lovely. Are you excited to see Sunset Manor?" "Very much so." The drive took 15 minutes through neighborhoods that had been transitioning for years, older homes being replaced by modern developments, family businesses giving way to chain stores. Sunset Manor occupied a sprawling lot that had once housed a private estate, its main building a renovated mansion surrounded by newer wings that had been added over the decades. "Beautiful grounds," Brittany observed as they pulled into the circular drive. "Just imagine being able to walk these gardens without worrying about maintenance or upkeep." Sarah studied the landscaping with a more critical eye, noting areas where deferred maintenance was evident. Overgrown hedges, cracked walkways, a fountain that appeared to be drained for the season, rather than genuinely maintained. The director, Mrs. Patricia Ellis, met them at the main entrance with the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to managing family emotions during difficult transitions. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of comfortable authority that suggested genuine experience in healthcare administration. "Mrs. Jackson, what a pleasure to meet you. Brittany has told me so much about your situation." Sarah shook the offered hand, noting the careful phrasing. Her situation, not her interests, not her preferences, but the circumstances that had supposedly brought her here as a potential resident rather than visitor. The tour began in the main lobby, a space that retained much of the original mansion's grandeur, despite institutional modifications. Persian rugs that had seen better days covered polished hardwood floors, and crystal chandeliers provided warm lighting that softened the clinical elements. "We pride ourselves on maintaining the dignity and character of this historic property," Mrs. Ellis explained, leading them toward the dining room. "Many of our residents find great comfort in the familiar elegance." The dining room buzzed with the controlled activity of the lunch hour. Sarah observed the residents. Some engaged in animated conversation, others sitting quietly, a few requiring assistance from staff members who moved with efficient professionalism. The scene was neither depressing nor particularly inspiring. It was institutional care at its most competent and routine. "The meal program is excellent," Brittany interjected. "No more worrying about grocery shopping or cooking for yourself." Sarah noticed how Brittany framed each amenity as relief from current responsibilities rather than enhancement to current capabilities. The message was consistent. Life here would be easier because life at home had become unmanageably difficult. They toured the activity rooms, where residents participated in crafts projects and exercise classes designed for limited mobility. The library featured large print books and comfortable seating arranged to encourage social interaction. The medical wing showcased equipment and protocols that emphasized safety and rapid response to health emergencies. "Our staffing ratios exceed state requirements," Mrs. Ellis noted with pride that seemed genuine. "We believe in proactive rather than reactive care." It was during the tour of the residential wings that Sarah met Rosa Martinez. Rosa was holding court in the common area of the independent living section, her wheelchair positioned strategically to intercept anyone passing through. Despite being clearly in her late 60s and showing signs of stroke recovery, her eyes were sharp and her voice carried the authority of someone unaccustomed to being ignored. "Excuse me," Rosa called out as their tour group passed. "Are you here as family or potential residents?" Mrs. Ellis stepped forward diplomatically. "Mrs. Martinez, this is Mrs. Jackson and her family. They're touring our facilities." Rosa's gaze fixed on Sarah with unmistakable recognition, not of Sarah personally, but of the situation she represented. "First time looking at places like this?" "Yes," Sarah replied, surprised by the direct question. Whose idea was it? The question hung in the air with uncomfortable clarity. Mrs. Ellis cleared her throat gently. "Mrs. Martinez is one of our more outspoken residents. She takes a great interest in newcomers." "I take an interest in making sure people understand what they're getting into," Rosa corrected firmly. "There's a difference between choosing to be here and being convinced you should be here." Brittany's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "We're just exploring options. Sarah's family wants to make sure she has the support she needs." Uh-huh. Rose's expression suggested she'd heard similar explanations before. To Sarah, she said, "Feel free to ask me questions if you have any. I've been here 2 years, and I don't sugarcoat things." As they continued the tour, Sarah found herself thinking about Rose's distinction between choosing and being convinced. The facility itself seemed competent enough. Clean, well-staffed, offering genuine amenities and care. But the underlying assumption remained that she belonged here because she could no longer manage independently. The tour concluded in Mrs. Ellis's office, where brochures and admission paperwork were arranged with subtle inevitability. The conversation shifted from showcasing amenities to discussing practical matters: waiting lists, financial arrangements, transition timelines. "Of course, we understand this is a significant decision," Mrs. Ellis said, addressing David and Brittany more than Sarah. "But given the current waiting list, we wouldn't want to delay too long if Mrs. Jackson is seriously interested." "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" Brittany asked. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Quote, "For someone with Mrs. Jackson's profile, we could probably arrange admission within 2 to 3 weeks." Sarah listened to them discuss her future as if she were a problem to be solved, rather than a person making a choice. The casual assumption that her input would be limited to preference details, rather than fundamental decisions, crystallized her growing anger into something sharper and more focused. "I'd like some time to think this over," she said finally. "Of course, Mom," David replied quickly. "This is a big decision." "Take all the time you need," Mrs. Ellis agreed. "Though, as I mentioned, the waiting list situation does create some urgency." During the drive home, the conversation centered on scheduling a follow-up meeting to, quote, "discuss next steps." Sarah agreed to dinner at a restaurant near her house, understanding that the neutral location was chosen to manage her emotional responses to what was coming. The restaurant was one of those family-friendly chains that specialized in managing difficult conversations with comfortable ambiance and reliable service. David ordered wine for the table while Brittany organized papers from her portfolio with the efficiency of someone accustomed to closing deals. "Mom," David began carefully, "Brittany and I have been doing some research. About your situation, about options that might give you more security and peace of mind." "What kind of research?" Brittany leaned forward with the earnest expression of someone delivering unwelcome but necessary news. "Sarah, we're concerned about your safety living alone. The house is beautiful, but it's expensive to maintain on a fixed income, and if something were to happen..." She proceeded to outline a comprehensive case built on financial projections, health statistics, and carefully selected anecdotes about elderly people who had waited too long to transition to appropriate care. The presentation was polished, persuasive, and completely dismissive of Sarah's actual capabilities or preferences. "The bottom line," David said, his voice heavy with what he clearly believed was reluctant responsibility, "is that we think Sunset Manor would be perfect for you. Better medical care, social activities, no maintenance worries. And honestly, Mom, the financial relief would be significant." Sarah sipped her wine, noting how David's voice changed when he mentioned financial relief. The slight tension that suggested money was more of a consideration than he wanted to admit. "What if I'm not ready to make that transition?" Brittany and David exchanged glances that confirmed what Sarah had suspected. This wasn't a request. "Mom," David said carefully, "if you're not willing to consider this voluntarily, there are legal options for families who are concerned about their elderly relatives' safety and decision-making capacity." The threat was delivered with gentle regret, but it was unmistakably a threat. Sarah felt the familiar calm that had always descended when negotiations turned hostile. "I see. And if I were to agree to consider Sunset Manor, what timeline did you have in mind?" 2 weeks, Brittany said promptly. "Just to get your affairs in order and make the transition as smooth as possible." Sarah nodded slowly, her mind already working through the implications and opportunities. "I'll need that time to arrange my finances and personal belongings." David's relief was palpable. "Of course, Mom, we'll help with everything." "That's very kind, but I think I can handle the arrangements myself." As they drove her home, Sarah listened to David and Brittany discuss logistics with the satisfaction of people who had successfully managed a difficult but necessary intervention. They spoke about her as if she had already ceased to be an independent agent in her own life. Standing in her kitchen after they left, Sarah opened Harold's folder and reviewed the financial projections for Sunset Manor one more time. Then she picked up her phone and dialed his number. "Harold, it's Sarah. I want you to submit a formal offer for Sunset Manor tomorrow morning. Full asking price, cash, 30-day close. Are you certain?" Sarah looked around the kitchen where she'd raised David, where she'd built her secret financial empire, where she'd just been told she could no longer safely live. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. They want to put me in Sunset Manor? Perfect. I'll be very comfortable there, as the owner." Harold arrived at Sarah's house the next morning carrying 2 briefcases instead of his usual portfolio, a detail that would have seemed insignificant to most observers, but spoke volumes about the magnitude of what they were about to undertake. Sarah had spent the night in her study, surrounded by decades of financial records she'd kept meticulously private, preparing for a conversation that would transform her from perceived victim to strategic predator. "I've drafted the initial offer," Harold said, settling into the familiar chair across from her kitchen table. "But before we proceed, I need to make sure you understand the full implications of this move." Sarah poured coffee from the same pot she'd used to serve David breakfast for 18 years, the domestic ritual providing strange comfort as she prepared to reveal the extent of her hidden financial empire. "Show me everything." Harold opened the first briefcase with the reverence of a curator handling museum pieces. Inside were folders organized with the precision that had made him one of Seattle's most trusted financial advisors, each representing a different aspect of Sarah's carefully constructed wealth. "Your primary investment portfolio," he began, sliding the first folder across the table. "Current value approximately $14.7 million. Sarah opened the folder to reveal statements that would have shocked anyone who knew her only as David's widowed mother living on a bank pension. Decades of compound growth had transformed modest monthly investments into a fortune that rivaled many of her former clients' holdings. "The real estate investments," Harold continued, producing another folder. 7 properties across 3 states. Current estimated value $4.2 million. Sarah studied the documents, remembering each purchase decision. The duplex in Portland she'd bought when David was 12. The small apartment complex in Phoenix acquired during the recession. The commercial property in downtown Seattle that had tripled in value over 15 years. Each investment had been researched obsessively, purchased strategically, and managed with the same analytical rigor she'd once applied to corporate acquisitions. "Municipal bonds, treasury securities, and money market accounts," Harold said, opening a third folder. "Conservative investments totaling approximately $3.1 million. The numbers accumulated with devastating precision. Sarah Jackson, the elderly widow her family sought to institutionalize for her own protection, controlled liquid assets exceeding $22 million. "How long have you been planning this level of financial independence?" Harold asked. Sarah traced her finger along a portfolio summary that represented 4 decades of patient accumulation. "Since the day David's father died and I realized no one was coming to rescue me. I was 28 years old with a toddler and a bank teller's salary. I decided that would never be enough." "And David has no idea?" "None. I believed money should be earned, not inherited. I wanted him to develop his own work ethic, his own sense of accomplishment." Sarah's voice carried the weight of a decision that now seemed both wise and tragically ironic. "I never imagined that financial independence would become a weapon in my own family's hands." Harold nodded slowly, understanding the complexity of Sarah's position. Her success had been built on secrecy that now complicated her ability to defend herself against those who assumed her vulnerability. "The Sunset Manor acquisition becomes much more interesting in this context," he observed. "Show me what you've learned about their situation." Harold opened the second briefcase, revealing research that demonstrated why he'd built a reputation for thoroughness that attracted clients like Sarah. Sunset Manor is owned by Pacific Northwest Senior Care, a regional corporation that operates 6 facilities across Washington and Oregon. They've been struggling since the pandemic disrupted the industry. The documents painted a picture of an organization caught between rising operational costs and declining revenue. Occupancy rates had dropped 15% over 2 years, while staffing costs had increased due to higher wages needed to attract healthcare workers in a competitive market. Their debt structure is particularly problematic, Harold continued. They're carrying approximately $12 million in combined mortgage and operational debt across all properties. Cash flow is negative at 4 of their 6 facilities, with Sunset Manor being the worst performer. Sarah studied the financial statements with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades evaluating investment opportunities. They're vulnerable to acquisition. Extremely vulnerable. Based on my preliminary conversations with their corporate office, they'd likely accept any serious cash offer that covered their debt obligations. What would you estimate as a realistic purchase price? For Sunset Manor specifically, given their situation, probably $7 to $8 million for the property, plus assumption of approximately $1.2 million in facility-specific debt. Total acquisition cost around $9 million. Sarah leaned back in her chair, considering the implications. The purchase would represent less than half her liquid assets, a significant but manageable investment that would fundamentally alter the power dynamics with David and Brittany. I want to tour the facility again, she said, but this time as a potential buyer, not a potential resident. That will require some delicate maneuvering. We can't reveal your interest without risking word getting back to your family. Sarah smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd solved more complex problems during her banking career. I have an idea about that. 2 hours later, Harold was making a phone call to Pacific Northwest Senior Care's corporate office, introducing himself as the representative for an unnamed private investor interested in acquiring underperforming senior care facilities as part of a portfolio expansion strategy. My client prefers to maintain anonymity during initial evaluations, Harold explained to the corporate development director. However, I can assure you that we're prepared to move quickly with cash offers for properties that meet our investment criteria. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Would Harold's client be available for a private tour of Sunset Manor that afternoon? The facility's administrator and their corporate development team could provide a comprehensive operational briefing. Excellent, Harold replied. My client will be accompanied by a consulting geriatrician who specializes in care quality assessment. We take a very hands-on approach to due diligence. Sarah had suggested the consulting geriatrician cover story, remembering Dr. Sarah Reeves from her previous tour. If she was going to evaluate Sunset Manor as a potential purchase, she needed to understand the medical care challenges that would come with ownership. The afternoon tour revealed a different perspective on the facility Sarah had visited just days earlier as a prospective resident. Corporate representatives spoke candidly about operational challenges, staffing difficulties, and infrastructure needs that had been diplomatically minimized during the family-focused presentation. The physical plant requires significant capital investment, admitted James Morrison, the corporate development director. Deferred maintenance over the past 3 years has created a backlog of approximately $800,000 in necessary repairs and upgrades. Sarah observed details she'd missed during her first visit: aging HVAC systems, outdated medical equipment, staffing patterns that suggested minimal rather than optimal care ratios. The facility wasn't failing, but it was clearly operating at maintenance level rather than excellence. What about regulatory compliance? Harold asked. We meet all state requirements, Morrison replied carefully. Though we're aware that regulatory standards continue to evolve, particularly around resident care protocols and family communication, the diplomatic language couldn't obscure the underlying reality. Sunset Manor was doing the minimum necessary to maintain its license while struggling to provide the quality of care that families deserved and residents needed. During a break in the corporate presentation, Sarah managed to speak privately with Dr. Sarah Reeves, who was reviewing medication protocols in the facility's medical wing. Dr. Reeves, I'm Sarah Jackson. We met briefly during a family tour earlier this week. Dr. Reeves looked up from her charts, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to genuine concern. Mrs. Jackson, are you here for a follow-up visit? In a manner of speaking, I'm actually here as a consultant, evaluating the facility's operational status. Sarah gestured toward Harold, who was engaged in conversation with Morrison near the nurses' station. I wanted to get your perspective on the quality of care currently being provided. Dr. Reeves studied Sarah with the clinical assessment skills that had made her an effective geriatrician. Something in Sarah's manner, the authoritative tone, the strategic questioning, clearly didn't match the vulnerable elderly woman she'd expected to see again. "Are you considering some kind of investment in the facility?" "Potentially. If I were to acquire Sunset Manor, what would be your assessment of the changes needed to provide genuinely excellent elder care?" The question hung between them for a moment as Dr. Reeves processed the implications. "You're not here as a potential resident. Number? I'm here as someone who might be able to make this place everything it should be, instead of everything it currently is." Dr. Reeves glanced around the medical wing, ensuring their conversation remained private. "The current corporate structure prioritizes cost containment over care quality. We meet regulatory minimums, but we could be doing so much more with adequate resources and leadership support." "Such as?" "Improved staffing ratios, better training programs, upgraded medical equipment, enhanced activities programming, family engagement initiatives." Dr. Reeves's voice carried the passion of someone who'd been frustrated by systemic limitations. "This facility has incredible potential, but it needs an owner who understands that quality care requires investment, not just compliance." Sarah nodded, recognizing the same dedication to excellence that had driven her own career success. "If someone were to acquire Sunset Manor with the goal of transforming it into a model facility, would you be interested in leading that transformation?" "Absolutely. But it would require significant changes to current operational philosophy." "I'm very comfortable with significant changes, Dr. Reeves." Their conversation was interrupted by Harold's approach, his expression indicating that the corporate presentation had revealed everything they needed to know about Sunset Manor's vulnerability and potential. "Mrs. Jackson," Harold said formally, maintaining their consulting cover, "I believe we have sufficient information to make a recommendation to our client." During the drive back to Sarah's house, Harold outlined the acquisition timeline they'd discussed with Morrison. "They're motivated to move quickly. With the right offer structure, we could close within 30 days. "What about regulatory approval?" "Minimal requirements for this type of transaction: change of ownership filings, background checks, operational continuity plans. Nothing that would create significant delays." Sarah stared out the window at neighborhoods that had housed her entire adult life, the communities where she'd raised David, built her fortune, and now faced the possibility of exile. The acquisition of Sunset Manor would represent more than a financial investment. It would be a declaration of independence that would fundamentally alter her relationship with her family. "Submit the offer tomorrow morning," she said finally. "Full asking price, cash, 30-day close." "Sarah, once you do this, there's no going back. Your family will know exactly who they've been underestimating." Sarah thought about David's threat of legal guardianship, Brittany's systematic campaign to establish her incompetence, the casual assumption that her life could be reorganized around other people's convenience. "Harold, I've spent 40 years preparing for exactly this kind of challenge. They want to treat me like a helpless dependent? Perfect. I'll show them what a dependent with $22 million can accomplish." That evening, Sarah sat in her study reviewing the acquisition documents Harold had prepared. The offer was comprehensive, designed to appeal to a corporation desperate for capital infusion. By tomorrow afternoon, Pacific Northwest Senior Care would be considering a proposal that would transform Sarah Jackson from potential Sunset Manor resident to Sunset Manor owner. The irony was rich enough to savor. David and Brittany had orchestrated this entire situation, convinced they were managing an elderly woman's inevitable decline. Instead, they had provided Sarah with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate exactly how much they had misunderstood about power, money, and the woman they thought they knew. In 14 days, she was supposed to report to Sunset Manor as a new resident, surrendering her independence to an institution chosen by others for her supposed benefit. Instead, she would arrive as the owner, holding the deed to her own supposed prison. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. David's name appeared on the caller, ID. "Hi, Mom. Just calling to check on how you're feeling about everything. I know this is a big change." Sarah looked at the acquisition documents spread across her desk, contracts that would redefine everything David thought he knew about his mother's capabilities and resources. "I'm feeling very good about the change, honey. I think Sunset Manor is going to be perfect for me. Quote, I'm so glad to hear that, Mom. Brittany and I have been worried, but we really think this is the right decision. Oh, David, Sarah said, signing the first page of the offer documents. I couldn't agree more. The call from Harold came at 7:30 on a Friday morning, 13 days after Sarah had submitted her offer to acquire Sunset Manor. She answered on the second ring, already dressed and alert despite the early hour, a habit from decades of international markets that required attention at unconventional times. Sarah, it's done. Pacific Northwest Senior Care accepted your offer. Full asking price, 30-day close, all contingencies waived. You now own Sunset Manor. Sarah set down her coffee cup with steady hands, though something fundamental shifted inside her chest, the sensation of crossing a threshold from which there could be no retreat. When do I take possession? Legally, at close of business today. Practically, you can begin making operational decisions immediately. The corporate management team is being notified this morning that they report to you now. And David and Brittany? Still believe you're being admitted as a resident on Monday, as planned. Sarah walked to her study window, looking out at the garden where she'd spent 40 years cultivating both flowers and financial independence. In 3 days, she would leave this house, not as a defeated elderly woman being processed into institutional care, but as a successful businesswoman who had just acquired her 9th major investment property. Harold, I want you to call David this morning. Tell him there's been a slight change in the admission process, that I need to meet with the facility administrator before moving in. Ask him and Brittany to meet me at Sunset Manor on Monday at 2 o'clock. Are you certain you want to handle the revelation this way? Sarah thought about David's threat of legal guardianship, about Brittany's systematic campaign to establish her incompetence, about the casual assumptions that had governed every conversation about her future. I'm certain. They orchestrated this entire situation believing they were managing a helpless dependent. It's time they learned exactly who they've been manipulating. Monday afternoon arrived clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline autumn light that made Seattle's landscape appear deceptively peaceful. Sarah arrived at Sunset Manor 30 minutes early, wanting time to orient herself to her new role before the confrontation that would define everything that followed. Mrs. Ellis met her at the main entrance, her professional smile slightly strained by the morning's revelations about the facility's change in ownership. Mrs. Jackson, or should I say, the new owner of Sunset Manor. This is certainly an unexpected development. Life is full of surprises, Patricia. I trust the transition has been smooth? As smooth as can be expected. The staff is naturally curious about what changes you might implement. Sarah studied the lobby with different eyes now, not as a potential resident evaluating amenities, but as an owner assessing assets and opportunities. We'll be making significant improvements, but gradually and with input from people who understand the daily operations. And your family? Do they know about your change in status? They're about to find out. At exactly 2 o'clock, David's car pulled into the circular drive. Sarah watched through the main lobby windows as he and Brittany gathered what appeared to be moving boxes and personal items from the trunk, supplies for what they believed would be Sarah's permanent relocation. She positioned herself in the center of the lobby, standing rather than sitting, her posture conveying authority rather than submission. Behind her, several residents had gathered in the common areas, curious about the unusual afternoon activity. David entered first, carrying a suitcase and wearing the expression of someone steeling himself for an emotionally difficult task. Brittany followed with a clipboard and folder, her professional efficiency barely masking what Sarah now recognized as anticipation at successfully completing a complex manipulation. "Mom!" David's voice carried forced cheerfulness. "Ready for your big move?" "Very ready," Sarah replied calmly. Brittany stepped forward with the brisk authority of someone accustomed to managing real estate closings. "Sarah, I've brought all the admission paperwork. Mrs. Ellis said there were some administrative details to handle before we complete your move-in process." "That's correct. There have been some significant administrative changes." Mrs. Ellis appeared beside Sarah, her presence lending official weight to whatever was about to unfold. "Mr. and Mrs. Jackson, thank you for coming. As I mentioned on the phone, there are some important developments regarding Mrs. Jackson's situation." David set down the suitcase, his expression shifting toward concern. Is there a problem with the admission? Did something change with the waiting list? You could say that, Sarah said quietly. Brittany consulted her clipboard with the impatience of someone accustomed to controlling timelines. What kind of administrative issues? The financial arrangements were all confirmed last week. Sarah looked at her son, really looked at him, seeing both the child who had once trusted her completely and the man who had learned to trust others. Assessments of her competence more than his own knowledge of her character. David, there's something I need to tell you about my situation. What kind of something? His voice carried the wariness of someone who had learned to expect complications from elderly relatives. I'm not moving into Sunset Manor as a resident. Sarah's voice remained steady, conversational. I'm moving in as the owner. The words settled in the lobby like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of confusion that spread across David and Brittany's faces as they processed the implications. What do you mean, owner? Brittany asked, her professional smile faltering. Mrs. Ellis stepped forward with the clinical precision of someone delivering medical news. As of Friday morning, Sunset Manor was purchased by Mrs. Jackson through a private acquisition. She now owns this facility. David's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, dawning comprehension, and something that might have been panic. Mom, what are you talking about? You don't have money to buy. He stopped, the sentence hanging incomplete as decades of assumptions about his mother's financial situation began to crumble. Brittany's reaction was more direct. That's impossible. Sarah is living on a fixed income. Bank pensions don't generate the kind of capital required for commercial real estate acquisition. Bank pensions don't, Sarah agreed calmly, but 40 years of strategic investment do. She watched as Brittany's carefully constructed narrative collapsed in real time. The helpless elderly woman who needed protection and guidance had just revealed herself as someone with resources that exceeded anything Brittany had imagined possible. How much money do you have? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Enough to buy this facility for cash and still maintain my independence indefinitely. Rosa Martinez had wheeled herself closer during the conversation, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the family drama unfolding in her home's lobby. Other residents gathered behind her, sensing that something significant was happening that might affect their daily lives. So you're the new owner Rosa told us about, called out Mr. Peterson, a retired engineer who rarely spoke during communal activities. The one who's supposed to make this place actually worth living in. Sarah turned toward the residents, seeing them clearly for the first time as the people she would now be responsible for serving. I intend to make Sunset Manor a place where dignity and quality of life aren't optional. Brittany had recovered enough to shift into damage control mode, her real estate training providing scripts for managing unexpected complications. Sarah, this is clearly a very impulsive decision. Major financial commitments should be discussed with family, especially at your age. There might be ways to reverse this transaction if what? Sarah's voice carried the authority that had once silenced boardrooms full of aggressive executives. If my family decides I'm not competent to manage my own financial affairs? The challenge hung between them, forcing David and Brittany to confront the fundamental assumptions that had driven their entire campaign to relocate Sarah. David sat down heavily in one of the lobby chairs, his face pale with what Sarah recognized as a mixture of shock and dawning guilt. Mom, I don't understand. If you have this kind of money, why didn't you tell me? Why did you let us think you needed help? Because I wanted to see what kind of help you thought I needed, Sarah replied quietly. And I learned that you believed I was incapable of making my own decisions about my life. Brittany's professional composure finally cracked entirely. This is ridiculous. No one spends millions of dollars just to prove a point about family dynamics. You're right, Sarah said. I didn't buy Sunset Manor to prove a point. I bought it because you convinced me that this was where I belonged. So I decided to make it a place where I would actually want to belong. She looked around the lobby, at the residents who had become her responsibility, at the staff who were depending on her leadership, at the son who was struggling to reconcile the mother he thought he knew with the woman standing before him. David, you and Brittany were right about one thing. It was time for me to make a significant life change. I just chose a different change than the one you had planned for me. The conversation that followed would determine whether the family could rebuild trust after betrayal, or whether Sarah's victory would come at the cost of the relationship she valued most. But for the first time in months, she was negotiating from a position of strength, rather than defending against assumptions about her weakness. The residents of Sunset Manor had a new owner who understood exactly what it felt like to be underestimated. And David and Brittany were about to learn that some battles are lost the moment you choose the wrong opponent. The silence in Sunset Manor's lobby stretched for nearly a full minute after Sarah's revelation, broken only by the distant sound of dinner preparations from the kitchen and the soft hum of the building's aging HVAC system. David remained seated in the lobby chair, staring at his mother as if she were a stranger wearing a familiar face. Brittany stood frozen, her clipboard held at an odd angle, her professional composure completely shattered. "I need some air," David said finally, his voice hollow. He stood abruptly and walked toward the entrance, pushing through the heavy glass doors without looking back. Brittany watched him go, then turned to Sarah with an expression that combined fury and calculation in equal measure. "This isn't over," she said quietly, her voice carrying a cold precision that revealed more about her true nature than months of careful manipulation had concealed. "You may have surprised us today, but there are other ways to establish that someone isn't competent to make major financial decisions." Sarah met her daughter-in-law's gaze with the steady calm of someone who had spent decades negotiating with people far more sophisticated than Brittany Walsh Jackson. "Are you threatening me? I'm informing you that impulse purchases of this magnitude raise legitimate questions about judgment and mental capacity, questions that family members have both the right and responsibility to pursue." Rosa Martinez wheeled herself closer, her sharp eyes taking in every nuance of the confrontation. "Lady, I've been watching people try to manipulate their way into controlling other people's money for 2 years in this place. You just threatened the wrong person." Brittany's attention snapped to Rosa, her real estate agent's smile returning with mechanical precision. "I'm sorry, but this is a private family matter." "Not anymore, it isn't," Rosa replied firmly. "She's our owner now, which makes it our business too. And honey, you just made the mistake of threatening someone who has the resources to fight back." Other residents had gathered in the common areas adjacent to the lobby, drawn by the unusual afternoon drama. Sarah realized that her confrontation with David and Brittany was unfolding in front of the people who would be most affected by whatever happened next. "Mrs. Ellis," Sarah said, turning to the facility administrator, "could you show me to the owner's apartment? I'd like to get settled before dinner." "Of course. It's on the second floor of the original mansion, overlooking the gardens." As they walked toward the main staircase, Sarah could hear Brittany making a phone call in the lobby, her voice low but urgent. The words competency evaluation and emergency intervention carried clearly enough to confirm that the battle was far from over. The owner's apartment occupied what had once been the master suite of the original estate, with tall windows that provided sweeping views of the grounds and enough space for both living and office areas. Sarah's personal belongings, packed by David and Brittany for what they believed would be her transition to resident status, sat in boxes near the door. "The previous ownership rarely used this space," Mrs. Ellis explained. "They preferred managing operations remotely. Your decision to live on-site represents a significant philosophical change." Sarah walked to the windows, looking down at the gardens where residents took afternoon walks along paths that needed maintenance and landscaping that showed signs of budget constraints. "What's the most pressing operational challenge we're facing?" "Honestly, staff morale. The previous corporate structure treated this facility as a cost center rather than a care center. Employees know they're understaffed and under-resourced, but they care about the residents enough to keep trying." "What about resident satisfaction?" Mrs. Ellis hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Most families are satisfied with basic care and safety. But residents like Rosa Martinez have higher expectations. They want meaningful activities, better food, more autonomy in their daily schedules. Under the previous ownership, those requests were considered complaints rather than improvement opportunities." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Dr. Sarah Reeves entered, carrying a medical chart and wearing the expression of someone who had spent the afternoon processing unexpected developments. "Mrs. Jackson, I wanted to welcome you officially and discuss some immediate medical care concerns. Please call me Sarah. What kind of concerns? Dr. Reeves settled into one of the apartment's comfortable chairs, her manner shifting from formal courtesy to professional collaboration. We have several residents with complex care needs who aren't receiving optimal treatment under current protocols. Budget constraints have limited our ability to provide comprehensive geriatric care, such as physical therapy programs that could significantly improve mobility for stroke recovery patients like Rosa, mental health support for residents dealing with depression and anxiety related to life transitions, medication management systems that go beyond basic compliance to optimize quality of life. Sarah listened with the focused attention she'd once applied to investment prospectuses, understanding that Dr. Reeves was describing opportunities rather than problems. What would it cost to implement these improvements? For a facility this size, probably an additional $250,000 annually in staffing and program costs, but the improvement in resident outcomes would be substantial. Done. Draft a proposal with specific recommendations and timelines. Dr. Reeves looked startled by the immediate approval. Just like that? Dr. Reeves, I didn't buy this facility to maintain the status quo. I bought it to prove that dignified elder care is possible when someone actually prioritizes it. Over the following hours, Sarah began to understand the complexity of her new role. Mrs. Ellis introduced her to department heads who ranged from cautiously optimistic to openly skeptical about what an elderly new owner might mean for their daily operations. The head of nursing, Margaret Wells, presented staffing challenges with the weary professionalism of someone who had learned to work miracles with inadequate resources. We're currently operating with minimum state-required ratios, Margaret explained during an impromptu meeting in Sarah's apartment. 1 nurse for every 8 residents during day shifts, 1 for 12 during nights. It meets regulatory requirements, but it doesn't allow for the kind of individualized attention that makes the difference between existing and thriving. What would optimal staffing look like? 1 nurse for every 6 residents during days, 1 for 8 at night, plus additional certified nursing assistants and a full-time social worker. Sarah made notes on a legal pad, calculating costs with the same analytical precision she'd applied to portfolio management. The financial investment would be significant, but well within her means and clearly justified by the potential for improved outcomes. Implement the optimal staffing plan immediately. Hire whoever you need. Margaret's professional composure cracked slightly. Mrs. Jackson, that represents a substantial increase in operational costs. Margaret, I'm not here to run a minimally compliant facility. I'm here to run an excellent one. As evening approached, Sarah found herself in the dining room, observing the dinner service with fresh eyes. The food was adequate but uninspiring. Institutional meals designed for efficiency rather than enjoyment. Residents ate with the resignation of people who had learned not to expect culinary pleasure from their daily nutrition. Rosa wheeled up to Sarah's table, carrying a dinner tray that exemplified the problem. Overcooked vegetables, under-seasoned protein, bread that's been sitting under heat lamps for an hour. This is what passes for fine dining in most places like this. What would you change? Fresh ingredients, proper seasoning, meals prepared in smaller batches instead of industrial quantities. Maybe even some options, instead of everyone getting the same thing, whether they like it or not. Sarah flagged down the dietary manager, a harried-looking woman named Patricia, who clearly hadn't expected to receive direct feedback from the new owner during her first day on the job. Patricia, I'd like to discuss upgrading our meal program. What would it take to provide restaurant-quality food instead of institutional meals? Well, it would require significant changes to our purchasing protocols, food preparation methods, staffing levels in the kitchen. Patricia's voice carried the tone of someone who had suggested improvements before, only to be told they were too expensive. Cost isn't the primary consideration. Quality is. I want our residents to look forward to meals, not just tolerate them. As dinner concluded, Sarah retreated to her apartment to process the day's revelations about both her family and her new responsibilities. Through the windows, she could see David's car still parked in the visitor lot, though he hadn't come back inside since his abrupt departure from the lobby confrontation. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Harold. Heard from several neighbors today asking questions about your mental state and whether you'd made any unusual financial decisions recently. Brittany's been busy. Sarah wasn't surprised by the information, though the speed of Brittany's response demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that explained how she'd been so successful in her previous elderly client manipulations. If Brittany couldn't control Sarah through family pressure, she would try to establish a public narrative about Sarah's mental competence. Another knock at her door revealed Rosa, who had maneuvered her wheelchair up to the second floor using the recently installed elevator. "Thought you might want some company for your first evening as the boss," Rosa said, wheeling herself into the apartment with the confidence of someone who had never let physical limitations dictate her social choices. "How are the other residents reacting to the ownership change?" "Mixed reactions. Some are excited about the possibility of improvements. Others are worried that change means disruption to routines they've gotten comfortable with. But mostly, people are curious about you." "What kind of curious?" Rosa studied Sarah with the shrewd assessment skills that had made her an effective union organizer. "They want to know if you're the kind of owner who sees them as problems to be managed, or as people with opinions worth considering." Sarah thought about the dinner conversation with Patricia, the staffing discussion with Margaret, Dr. Reeves's enthusiasm for expanded care programs. "I'm the kind of owner who believes that people don't lose their right to dignity and choice just because they need assistance with daily living." Good answer. But answers are easy. The question is whether you'll still feel that way when implementing change gets complicated and expensive. Through the window, Sarah watched David finally get out of his car and walk slowly toward the building entrance. Her son was coming back, probably to attempt some kind of conversation about the day's revelations. The discussion would be difficult, but necessary if they were going to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than assumptions. "Rosa, I spent 40 years building financial independence, specifically so I could make choices based on what's right rather than what's affordable. Today I learned that my own family didn't believe I was capable of making those choices. Tomorrow I start proving them wrong." The next phase of Sarah's transformation was beginning. From secret millionaire to hands-on owner, from family victim to community leader, from someone whose competence was questioned to someone whose judgment would determine the daily lives of dozens of vulnerable people. The real test wouldn't be surviving Brittany's attacks on her mental competence, but proving that wealth and good intentions could actually translate into meaningful improvements for people who had learned not to expect much from the institutions meant to care for them. Outside, David was walking toward an entrance that would bring him into his mother's new world, a world where she held both the power and the responsibility to transform how society treated its most underestimated citizens. David found Sarah in the facility's small library the next morning, reviewing architectural plans with a contractor who specialized in healthcare facility renovations. 3 weeks had passed since the ownership revelation, and the changes at Sunset Manor were already visible. Fresh flowers in the lobby, improved lighting in common areas, and the unmistakable energy that comes when staff members believe their work matters. "Mom?" David's voice carried the tentative quality of someone who had spent weeks processing a fundamental shift in his understanding of reality. "Could we talk?" Sarah looked up from blueprints that detailed plans for converting an underutilized storage area into a physical therapy suite. The contractor, sensing family business, excused himself with promises to return with revised cost estimates. "Of course, honey, how are you doing?" David sat across from her at the small reading table, his appearance suggesting sleepless nights and difficult conversations. "I've been thinking about what happened. About everything I assumed about you. About the choices I made. And? I was wrong. About all of it." His voice cracked slightly. "I convinced myself I was protecting you, but I was really just... I don't know what I was doing." Sarah studied her son's face, seeing both the boy who had once trusted her completely and the man who was now struggling to rebuild that trust after betraying it. "You were doing what Brittany convinced you was necessary." "That's not an excuse, Mom. I'm 45 years old. I should have trusted my own judgment about my own mother instead of letting someone else tell me what to think." Before Sarah could respond, the library door opened to admit Mrs. Ellis, who wore the expression of someone delivering unwelcome but necessary news. "Sarah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation." State regulatory inspectors are here for an unscheduled investigation. Someone filed complaints about our operational changes and the circumstances of the ownership transition. Sarah felt the familiar calm that had always descended during hostile negotiations. What kind of complaints? Questions about financial irregularities in the acquisition, concerns about operational disruptions affecting resident care, and… Mrs. Ellis paused, choosing her words carefully. Allegations that the new owner may not be mentally competent to operate a healthcare facility. David's face flushed with anger. Brittany. Most likely, Sarah agreed, standing and smoothing her jacket with the same composed authority she'd displayed in countless boardrooms. Where are the inspectors now? Main conference room. They've requested to speak with you immediately. Perfect. David, would you like to observe how your mother handles regulatory challenges? The state inspection team consisted of 3 officials: Janet Morrison from the Department of Health's Long-Term Care Division, Dr. Michael Chang from Quality Assurance, and Robert Kim, a financial compliance specialist. They had arranged themselves around the conference table with the methodical precision of people accustomed to investigating serious allegations. Mrs. Jackson. Janet Morrison began, consulting a tablet loaded with what appeared to be extensive documentation. We've received multiple complaints regarding recent changes at this facility. Our investigation will focus on 3 areas: the circumstances of your acquisition, operational modifications that may affect resident care, and concerns about your fitness to operate a licensed healthcare facility. Sarah took her seat at the head of the conference table, positioning herself as the facility's owner rather than a subject under investigation. I welcome your inquiry. What specific information do you need? Dr. Chang leaned forward slightly. Let's start with the acquisition. Can you explain how someone with no apparent background in healthcare administration came to purchase a major care facility? I have extensive background in financial management and strategic operations. For 30 years, I worked in investment banking, specializing in corporate acquisitions and operational improvements. Healthcare administration isn't fundamentally different from any other complex organizational challenge. Robert Kim consulted his notes. According to our information, this purchase was made impulsively, without proper due diligence, possibly during a period of mental decline that affects judgment. Sarah's expression didn't change, but David shifted visibly in his observer chair. Who provided that information? We're not required to reveal complaint sources, but we take all allegations seriously when they involve vulnerable populations. Of course you do. May I show you something? Sarah produced a folder Harold had prepared. Comprehensive documentation of her financial background, the systematic due diligence process that had preceded the acquisition, and detailed operational improvement plans developed with professional consultants. This acquisition was the result of 6 months of strategic planning, not impulsive decision-making. I can provide references from colleagues who have worked with me over the past 4 decades, all of whom will confirm my professional competence. Janet Morrison examined the documents with growing interest. These operational improvement plans are quite detailed. Have you begun implementing these changes? Extensively. Would you like to observe the results? What followed was a comprehensive tour that showcased everything Sarah had accomplished in 3 weeks of ownership. The inspection team observed the improved staffing ratios, interviewed residents about their satisfaction with recent changes, and reviewed upgraded food service protocols that had transformed institutional meals into restaurant-quality dining experiences. In the physical therapy area, they found Rosa Martinez working with a new therapist on exercises that were slowly restoring mobility she'd lost after her stroke. Under the previous ownership, Rosa's therapy had been limited to basic maintenance exercises designed to prevent further decline rather than promote recovery. The previous therapy protocol was adequate for compliance purposes, Dr. Chang observed. But this represents a significant enhancement in care quality. Mrs. Jackson believes that meeting minimum standards isn't sufficient when excellence is achievable, Rosa replied, demonstrating improved range of motion that would have been impossible under the old system. During lunch service, the inspection team observed residents choosing from multiple menu options, enjoying meals prepared fresh rather than reheated from industrial quantities. The dietary manager Patricia beamed as she explained the new purchasing protocols that emphasized fresh ingredients and smaller batch preparation. The transformation has been remarkable, Patricia told the inspectors. We're finally able to provide the kind of nutrition that enhances quality of life rather than just meeting caloric requirements. In the conference room afterward, the inspection team huddled for private consultation, while Sarah waited with the patience of someone who had spent decades in negotiations, where other people's assessments determined her professional future. Dr. Chang spoke first when they reconvened. Mrs. Jackson, I have to say that the operational improvements here are among the most impressive I've seen in 20 years of facility inspections. Whatever your background, you're clearly doing something right. Quote, "What about the financial irregularities mentioned in the complaints?" Robert Kim asked. Sarah produced additional documentation Harold had prepared, bank statements, transaction records, and professional references that demonstrated her legitimate financial capacity to make the acquisition. As you can see, this purchase was well within my means and properly executed through standard commercial real estate procedures. Janet Morrison closed her tablet with the air of someone whose investigation had taken an unexpected turn. Mrs. Jackson, based on our observations today, we find no evidence of operational problems, financial irregularities, or incompetent management. In fact, this facility appears to be exceeding care standards in multiple areas. However, Dr. Chang added, we're required to investigate all allegations thoroughly. The complaint included specific claims about your mental competence made by family members. Are you willing to undergo a formal cognitive assessment? David spoke up from his observer position. That won't be necessary. Everyone turned toward him, surprised by the interruption. I'm the family member who was quoted in those complaints. David continued, his voice steady but filled with regret. And I was wrong. My mother is clearly competent to make her own decisions and manage her own affairs. Any suggestion otherwise was based on my own misunderstanding of her capabilities. Dr. Chang consulted his notes. According to our documentation, the complaints were filed by Brittany Walsh Jackson, identifying herself as your wife and Mrs. Jackson's daughter-in-law. My wife filed those complaints without my knowledge or consent, David said firmly. And she certainly doesn't speak for me regarding my mother's competence. A knock at the conference room door interrupted the proceedings. Mrs. Ellis entered with a man Sarah didn't recognize, tall, weathered, with the practical appearance of someone who worked with his hands for a living. I'm sorry to interrupt, Mrs. Ellis said, but this gentleman insisted on speaking with Mrs. Jackson during the inspection. The man stepped forward, his manner suggesting both urgency and reluctance. Mrs. Jackson? I'm Tom Walsh, Brittany's brother. I think there are some things about my sister that you and these inspectors need to know. The tension in the room shifted perceptibly as everyone processed the implications of Brittany's brother arriving during a state investigation triggered by her complaints. Tom looked directly at the inspection team. My sister has done this before. Filed false complaints about elderly people's mental competence when she couldn't get control of their property through other means. I can provide you with names and documentation if you're interested. Janet Morrison reopened her tablet. We're very interested. What emerged over the next hour was a pattern that explained both Brittany's professional success and her current desperation. Tom provided details about 3 previous cases where Brittany had identified elderly homeowners, maneuvered herself into positions of influence with their families, and used concerns about mental competence to force property transactions that benefited her professionally. I should have spoken up sooner, Tom said, his voice heavy with guilt. But she's my sister, and I kept hoping she'd change. When David told me about the nursing home complaints, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. Dr. Chang made extensive notes, as Tom detailed his sister's methods. Why are you coming forward now? Because this time she went too far. Mrs. Jackson didn't just survive my sister's manipulation. She turned it into something positive for people who actually need help. When Brittany started filing false reports with state agencies, she crossed a line that puts everyone at risk. The inspection concluded with commendations for Sunset Manor's operational improvements and a recommendation that the complaint be reclassified as malicious rather than legitimate. More importantly for Sarah, The investigation had exposed Brittany's pattern of elder abuse to regulatory authorities who had the power to protect future victims. As the officials packed their materials, Janet Morrison approached Sarah privately. "Mrs. Jackson, would you be willing to serve as a witness if we pursue formal charges against Mrs. Walsh-Jackson for filing false reports?" "Absolutely." David waited until the inspection team had left before approaching his mother, his expression carrying both relief and profound regret. "Mom, I'm sorry. For all of it. For not trusting you, for letting Brittany manipulate me, for the threats about guardianship." His voice broke slightly. "I'm sorry for not being the son you deserved." Sarah looked at David, really looked at him, seeing the child who had run to her after nightmares, and the man who was now asking for forgiveness. The hurt was real, but so was the love that had survived everything Brittany had tried to destroy. "David, we're going to rebuild our relationship. But it's going to be based on who we actually are, not who we thought each other was." Outside the conference room windows, residents were enjoying the afternoon sun in gardens that were finally receiving proper maintenance. Rosa was leading what appeared to be an impromptu organizing meeting, probably planning some new initiative to improve daily life at the facility. Sarah had survived Brittany's counterattack, but more importantly, she had discovered her own capacity for leadership that went beyond financial success. The residents of Sunset Manor weren't just people she was responsible for, they were partners in creating something unprecedented in elder care. The real victory wasn't defeating Brittany's schemes, but proving that dignity and respect could be more than abstract ideals when backed by resources and genuine commitment. The call from Janet Morrison came 3 days after the state inspection concluded, finding Sarah in her office reviewing applications for a new activities coordinator position. The voice on the other end carried the satisfaction of a regulatory official who had uncovered exactly the kind of case that justified her department's existence. "Mrs. Jackson, I wanted to update you on our investigation into the false complaints filed against your facility. We've formally referred the matter to the State Attorney General's Office for prosecution, and the Real Estate Licensing Board has initiated disciplinary proceedings against Brittany Walsh-Jackson." Sarah set down the application she'd been reviewing, a former teacher interested in developing innovative programming for residents with varying cognitive abilities. "What kind of disciplinary action?" "Based on the pattern Tom Walsh documented, combined with our own investigation, she's facing suspension of her real estate license and possible criminal charges for filing false reports. We've also contacted the families from her previous cases to offer support for any civil actions they might choose to pursue." Through her office window, Sarah could see David in the garden, helping residents plant spring bulbs in beds that had been neglected under the previous ownership. He'd been coming to Sunset Manor every day since the investigation concluded, working alongside maintenance staff and volunteers, with the quiet determination of someone trying to rebuild trust through consistent action rather than words. "Mrs. Jackson?" Janet Morrison's voice drew her attention back to the phone call. "I'm here. Thank you for keeping me informed about the legal proceedings. There's one more thing. Your facility's operational improvements have attracted attention from other regulatory officials. We'd like to use Sunset Manor as a model for best practices in elder care. Would you be willing to participate in a case study?" Sarah considered the request, understanding its implications. Public recognition would validate her approach to senior care, but it would also eliminate any remaining privacy about her personal transformation from perceived dependent to industry leader. "I'd be honored to participate." After ending the call, Sarah walked to the window to observe David's work in the garden. Rosa Martinez had positioned her wheelchair nearby, clearly providing commentary and probably unsolicited advice about proper bulb planting techniques. The sight carried the warmth of watching relationships develop organically rather than being forced by circumstance. A knock at her door interrupted her observations. Mrs. Ellis entered carrying a folder thick with documents and wearing the expression of someone who had spent weeks processing extraordinary changes. "Sarah, I have Harold Kim here with some legal documents that require your attention, and David asked if he could speak with you when you have time." Harold entered carrying his familiar briefcase, but his manner suggested business more serious than routine financial management. "Sarah, we need to discuss the civil lawsuit Brittany has filed challenging your competency and the nursing home acquisition." Sarah felt the familiar calm that had always descended when negotiations turned adversarial. On what grounds? She's claiming that the acquisition was made during a period of diminished mental capacity, that family members expressed concerns about your judgment that were ignored, and that the transaction should be voided to protect your financial interests. Despite the state investigation that found no evidence of diminished capacity, she's arguing that the investigation was superficial and that your recent behavioral changes demonstrate underlying cognitive decline that affects your ability to make major financial decisions. Sarah sat behind her desk with the authority of someone who had spent decades responding to legal challenges. What's our response strategy? Harold opened his briefcase with methodical precision. Complete documentation of your financial competence, medical evaluations confirming your cognitive health, testimony from colleagues about your professional capabilities, and a comprehensive review of the acquisition process that demonstrates systematic due diligence. Timeline: preliminary hearing in 6 weeks. Given the evidence, I expect the case to be dismissed quickly, but we need to be prepared for Brittany to make this as public and embarrassing as possible. Sarah nodded, understanding that Brittany's lawsuit was less about legal merit than about creating a narrative that might pressure David to doubt his mother's competence once again. Harold, I want you to take the most aggressive legal stance possible. No settlements, no compromises. I want this case to serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider using elder abuse allegations as leverage. After Harold left, Sarah found David in the activities room, where he was helping residents organize a book club meeting. The sight of her son engaging naturally with elderly people, treating them as individuals with opinions and preferences rather than problems to be managed, provided evidence that their relationship might eventually heal from the damage Brittany had inflicted. David? Could we talk privately? They walked to the small library where Sarah had been reviewing renovation plans the morning after her ownership revelation. The space had become her preferred location for important conversations, perhaps because books provided context for the longer story they were all part of writing. Mom, I heard about Brittany's lawsuit. How are you handling it? David's expression carried the weight of someone who had learned painful lessons about trust and manipulation. I've hired my own attorney. I want to testify on your behalf about the pressure tactics Brittany used to convince me you were incompetent. Sarah studied her son's face, seeing both determination and lingering guilt. David, testifying against your wife in court will have consequences for your marriage. My marriage ended the day I learned what Brittany was really doing. The divorce papers were filed yesterday. The revelation settled between them with the heaviness of another relationship destroyed by Brittany's schemes. Sarah felt sadness for the pain David was experiencing, even though she recognized that his marriage had been built on deception from the beginning. I'm sorry you're going through this. I'm not. For the first time in 2 years, I'm making decisions based on what I actually believe is right, instead of what someone else convinced me to think. David's voice carried new strength. Mom, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Can you forgive me? Not the quick forgiveness you give because I'm your son, but the real kind that means you trust me again? Sarah looked at David, really looked at him, seeing the boy who had once trusted her completely, and the man who was now asking for a chance to earn that trust back. The hurt was real, but so was her recognition that David had been as much a victim of Brittany's manipulation as she had been. David, forgiveness isn't something that happens all at once. It's something that gets rebuilt through consistent actions over time. What kind of actions? The kind you're already taking. Coming here every day, getting to know the residents, working to understand what I'm trying to build instead of assuming you know what's best for me. David nodded slowly. I want to help with whatever you're doing here. Not because I feel guilty, but because I think it's important. What do you think we're doing here? Proving that getting older doesn't mean losing dignity. Showing that people deserve respect and good care regardless of their age or physical limitations. David paused, choosing his words carefully. Creating the kind of place where someone could actually want to live instead of just exist. Sarah felt something ease in her chest, the beginning of trust being rebuilt through understanding rather than assumption. That's exactly what we're doing. Through the library windows, they could see Rosa leading what appeared to be a residence meeting in the main lobby. Other residents were gathering with the energy of people who had learned their opinions mattered, and their voices would be heard. David, rebuilding our relationship is going to take time, but I want you to know that watching you work with the residents, seeing you treat them as people with wisdom and experience rather than problems to be managed, that gives me hope. Mom, I have one more question. What's that? When this is all over, when Brittany's lawsuit is dismissed and she faces consequences for what she did, what happens then? Sarah considered the question, understanding that David was really asking whether their family could survive the damage that had been done. Then we keep building something worth having, here at Sunset Manor and in our relationship with each other. As evening approached, Sarah walked through the facility that had become both her home and her mission. In the dining room, residents were enjoying dinner conversations that reflected genuine community rather than institutional routine. In the activities room, a painting class was creating artwork that would hang in common areas, giving residents ownership over their shared spaces. The transformation wasn't complete, probably never would be completely finished, but it was real. Sarah had discovered that her greatest challenge had also been her greatest opportunity to create something meaningful beyond her own family's conflicts. The legal battles with Brittany would continue, but Sarah faced them from a position of strength built on evidence rather than assumptions. She had proven her competence not just financially but through leadership that had improved dozens of lives in measurable ways. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight Sarah Jackson was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by people who had learned that dignity and respect weren't luxuries, but rights that someone finally had the resources and determination to protect. 6 months after Brittany's lawsuit had been dismissed with prejudice and her real estate license permanently revoked, Sarah stood in Sunset Manor's renovated community center, watching residents debate the merits of adding a greenhouse to the facility's expansion plans. The transformation was evident not just in the upgraded infrastructure, but in the confident voices of people who had learned their opinions carried weight in decisions about their daily lives. The greenhouse would provide therapeutic gardening opportunities year-round, argued Mrs. Chen, a retired botanist whose expertise had been ignored under the previous ownership, but we need to consider maintenance costs and accessibility requirements. Rosa Martinez, now serving as elected president of the resident council, facilitated the discussion with the same organizing skills that had once rallied teachers, unions. Dr. Reeves, what's your assessment of the therapeutic benefits versus the operational challenges? Dr. Reeves consulted notes from the comprehensive wellness program she'd developed with Sarah's support. The physical therapy benefits are significant, especially for residents recovering from strokes or managing arthritis. Combined with the mental health advantages of purposeful activity, I'd say the therapeutic value justifies the investment. Sarah observed the discussion without intervening, recognizing that her role had evolved from decision-maker to facilitator of resident self-determination. The greenhouse debate represented exactly the kind of meaningful choice that had been absent from institutional elder care, residents actively shaping their environment rather than passively accepting predetermined programs. David entered the community center carrying boxes of supplies for the afternoon art therapy session, his presence now so routine that residents greeted him with casual familiarity, rather than the polite deference typically shown to family members. Over 6 months of consistent volunteer work, he had earned acceptance through competence and genuine respect for the residents' autonomy. David, perfect timing, Rosa called out. We need someone with engineering background to explain load-bearing requirements for the Greenhouse Foundation. As David joined the discussion, Sarah reflected on the unexpected ways their relationship had healed. Instead of the guilt-driven reconciliation she had initially expected, they had built something more substantial, partnership based on shared commitment to meaningful work rather than obligation to family harmony. The resident council meeting concluded with formation of a greenhouse planning committee that would work with architects to develop detailed proposals. As residents dispersed to various afternoon activities, Sarah found herself alone with Rosa in the community center. You know what I appreciate most about what you've built here? Rosa asked, adjusting her wheelchair to face Sarah directly. What's that? You didn't just improve the services, you changed the power structure. We're not patients being cared for. We're community members making decisions about our shared space. Sarah nodded. understanding that Rosa had identified the fundamental difference between her approach and traditional institutional care. That was always the goal. People don't lose their right to self-determination just because they need assistance with daily living. Have you heard from Brittany since the criminal trial concluded? The question brought back memories of courtroom proceedings that had exposed the full extent of Brittany's systematic elder abuse across multiple cases. She moved to Arizona after her conviction. David received divorce papers last month, but there's been no direct contact. Good riddance. Though I have to admit, in a twisted way, we should probably thank her. Sarah raised an eyebrow. How so? Without her schemes, you might never have discovered that you had the resources and motivation to create something like this. Sometimes the worst attacks reveal opportunities we didn't know existed. The observation carried uncomfortable truth. Brittany's manipulation had forced Sarah to reveal capabilities she had kept hidden for decades, ultimately leading to innovations in elder care that benefited far more people than just herself. Dr. Reeves joined them, carrying evaluation reports that documented the facility's transformation in clinical terms. Sarah, I wanted to share the latest outcome data with you. Resident satisfaction scores have increased 40% since you took ownership. More importantly, we're seeing measurable improvements in physical health, cognitive function, and emotional well-being. What's driving the improvements? The combination of enhanced medical care, meaningful activities, better nutrition, and most significantly, residents feeling like they have agency in their daily lives. When people believe their choices matter, their overall health outcomes improve dramatically. As afternoon transitioned to evening, Sarah walked through the facility that had become both her home and her life's most important work. In the dining room, residents chose from multiple menu options while engaging in conversations that reflected genuine community rather than institutional routine. The library buzzed with book clubs, discussion groups, and informal mentoring relationships between residents with different backgrounds and expertise. The greenhouse debate had been resolved with typical resident council efficiency. They would build it, fund it through Sarah's capital improvement budget, and manage it through a rotating committee that would ensure both therapeutic programming and sustainable operations. Standing in her apartment later that evening, Sarah reviewed correspondence from other facility owners requesting consultation on implementing similar resident-centered approaches. Her transformation from threatened dependent to industry innovator was creating ripple effects that extended far beyond Sunset Manor's boundaries. David knocked softly before entering, carrying tea and wearing the comfortable expression of someone who had found purpose in unexpected places. "Mom, I wanted to ask you something." "Of course. Do you think we could expand this model? Maybe acquire other facilities that need transformation?" Sarah studied her son's face, seeing both ambition and genuine commitment to the work they had discovered together. "That's a very serious question, David." "I know. But I think what we've built here proves that excellent elder care is possible when someone prioritizes people over profits. Maybe we have a responsibility to scale that impact." Through her window, Sarah could see residents enjoying evening activities in common areas that buzzed with the energy of authentic community. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was surrounded by evidence that dignity and respect weren't luxuries. They were achievable goals when backed by resources and genuine commitment to treating people as individuals rather than problems to be managed. 1 year later, Sarah stood before a gathering of residents, families, and state officials, celebrating Sunset Manor's recognition as a model facility for dignified elder care. The transformation was complete, not just in upgraded amenities, but in the confident voices of people who had reclaimed agency over their daily lives. David approached with genuine pride rather than obligation. "Mom, the Seattle Times wants to interview you about expanding the resident-centered model to other facilities." Sarah smiled, watching Rosa lead a tour of the new greenhouse where residents grew vegetables for their own kitchen. Her greatest challenge had become her most meaningful accomplishment. "The last laugh," she murmured, "belongs to those who refuse to be underestimated." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,